40k Orks come with a load of different clans, and all of these clans have different themes, different schemes, and different lore. Today we're going to be tackling 5 of the more popular clans from the 40k Ork range, and besides that we're also going to be painting them all up in slightly different ways. So make sure to stick around to see how we paint up all of them, and drop a comment down below letting us know what's your favourite part of the models. Without further ado, let's jump into the first Ork Boy clan, and that's going to be the Evil Sons. For this scheme we need 2 paints. The first is, as to be expected, a green. We want this to be a bright green so we can get some colour contrast when we use our second colour, which is a dark rich blue. And we'll kick off the base coating of the skin in a mix of these 2 colours. This mix will be about 75% blue and 25% green, giving us a nice dark jade base coat. Once this base coat is dry, we can then mix a bit more of the bright green into our mix. We're looking for now around 50-50% between the 2 paints, and then we can use this to give the skin a relatively broad highlight. Here we're going to be catching the majority of all of the muscles, sharp sections of skins like folds on the face, as well as sections of the hands and fingers. We can then finish off the skin with a final round of finer highlights made up of a mix of our 2 colours again, but this time with about 75% being the light green in our mix. This mix is near enough almost pure bright green at this point, and we can use it to pick out the tops of muscles, tips of knuckles, and the brightest points of the face. You may be wondering, why are we opting to use a dark blue in this mix as opposed to, for example, a dark green, which you would expect for green skin? And the reason for that is that we're going to be painting the Evil Sons accoutrement and outfit and armour and things like that in a red. And as we know, red's quite a warm, hot tone. So what we're going to do is add a little bit of contrast, and this contrast is going to be achieved through cooling down the skin by using the blue in our mix. This means that we've got a cooler skin tone versus the warmer red tones, and we get a nice bit of contrast through doing that. So we will be tackling the reds in a second, but before we do, we need to deal with things like the trousers and all the brown elements across the model. We can get a nice outcome on these trousers by painting them similar to how we did the skin. However, what we're going to be doing is grabbing a dark brown and then a slightly lighter ochre tone. These will then be mixed up to give us a nice mid-tone. For this ratio, we're looking for slightly darker than a 50-50 mix, and then we can use that as a base coat across all of our areas of trousers. This can then be highlighted by adding some of the brighter ochre brown into our mix and applying a scratchy highlight to simulate the effect of worn fabric or worn leathers. We can then finish off all of these elements with a final edge highlight, and we're going to be coming in with a diluted version of our ochre with a tiny amount of the dark brown added in. With this, we want to pick out all of the sharp folds on the fabrics, or things like edges of straps and tips of knees. We can also take this dark brown and give the teeth a coat of this at the exact same time, and then come back to this later on. On this scheme, we're opting for a brown as the base coat and colour of our trousers, and we could swap this out for things like black and white, and essentially they just read as a neutral colour. However, what we want to bear in mind is that if we painted these black, there's going to be a big colour jump between the red colours that we've got and then the black. So by painting this as a brown, we get a nice neutral tone essentially within the scheme, but we do manage to still get a nice cohesive look across the main bulk of the model. But that does also mean that we can then come in with an actual black and then touch up on a few areas that we really don't want to draw attention to. Things like boots, pouches, things like that. These various elements can get a nice coat of a black contrast. We can also take the opportunity while this black is out to base coat any of the areas that we want to paint as metal a little bit later on. So these are elements like the weapons as well as the armour. With that done, we can move on to the other main colour of the model, which for the Evil Sons is red. We are going to want to start off with a dark red as a base coat colour, and then we can use this to pick out important elements as well as a few key main areas. For example, on this model we're picking out the shirt as the main bulk red area, but we're also picking out the odd bits such as the helmet, sections of the armour plating, as well as the ammo casings. We are naturally going to want to brighten up these red areas later on as we go, but let's first address the reason why we're putting red over the Evil Suns. Why do the Orks like red? Well, the reason for that is that, as we may know, Orks think that things that go red go faster, and because of the warg energy that coalesces with the amount of belief of the millions of Orks within a clan or across the universe believing a thing is possible, it actually manifests it. So the concept of red things go faster, even though I don't know if Orks understand the concept of concepts, but that concept of everything that is red goes faster, because they all believe in it, means that those things do actually go faster. So that explains why we're going to be covering this model in red on certain elements, as well as things like the bullet casings, because naturally a red bullet is going to hit its target better because it's faster, and fast things are good. So let's go on with brightening up these reds. What we want to do is build up from this red base coat, similar to how we did with the other stages of the skin and things like that, slowly blending our brighter colours into our base coat. The first round is going to be a relatively broad highlight, with a small amount of our bright red, with mostly our dark red present, going around and picking out pretty much all of the main surfaces. Then we will add a little bit more of the bright red to our mix. This will give us more of a 50-50 mix of our two colours, and we can use this to highlight all of the upward facing areas and any of these sharp points like folds or corners of metal elements. Then we are going to finish off all of the red areas with a slightly thinned red pure mix, just using our highlight red, but thinning this down so that we can apply it over the corners and edges to give us that really nice bright punch of red across the model. What's even better is, because of how we painted the skin in that relatively cool tone, we are getting a nice punch of contrast between those two warmer and colder elements. That means that the red actually looks punchier than it would on its own, so we get that nice feel from that area. We do need to finish off this model before we jump into a few tricks and tips on the rest of the Ork boys. So we've got things like metals and a couple of other elements just to finish off. The majority of these last elements we need to tackle are the metals, but before we tackle the metals, if we want to, we can go around and highlight the smaller odd sections, like the blacks, which can be highlighted with a mix of black contrast and the use of a pale desaturated blue to make a nice cool grey tone to edge highlight all of the blacks. Similar with things like the teeth, we can go grab a quick bone highlight and use this on all of the bones, fingernails and teeth across all of the models, leaving the browns in the recesses and the gums. With all of that dry, let's tackle the silvers, and what we're going to do is take a dark silver and apply this to all of the metals in a overbrush manner. This will catch all of the raised areas as well as the flat surfaces. Once it's dry, we can then take a bright silver and use this to edge highlight all of the metal areas, giving us that bright metal glint on the edges. This gives us our first painted boy, and I do really like how the red came out on this. It's really punchy, and the skin itself is a really nice subtle darker green tone. So with the main source of the speed freaks for the Ork clans, the Evil Suns are sorted. We could just go around and slap a few decals on there or something like that. Maybe putting the clan insignia on the back, adding some flames or things like that. But let's move on. Now that we've done the fast boys, let's do the lucky boys in the form of the death skulls. For this clan, we can start off with the skin, and we're going to be base coating the entirety of this skin in a color mix between a bright green and a dark red. This will give us a nice semi-dark desaturated muddy green, which will be used to base coat all of the skin, and then from here we can start to highlight up the various skin elements, similar to how we did with the Evil Suns Orks just a moment ago. We can target all of the raised elements like the face and tips of the muscles and things like that. This second colour will be a mix of our base coat mix with a little bit of extra green added to that initial mix. This will add a little bit more green vibrance to the skin tone and give us a nice gradual shift from the darker base coat to this new mid-tone. Then we want to make up our highlight colour, and we're going to mix, as you would expect, some more green into our original recipe. This will mean that we're essentially working with majority of green and just a touch of red added into the mix. This almost pure bright green is perfect to be glazed over and painted over the brightest parts of the skin. As I'm sure you can tell, we're now just essentially doing the inverse of what we did for our Evil Sunz boy. Whereas the Evil Sunz have red as their primary colour, so we added blue to the skin. For the Death Skulls, blue is the primary colour, so by adding that red to the skin, we're able to get that tonal contrast between the warm and cool tones of the skin. This also has the effect, because it's the opposite colour in the colour wheel, to kind of desaturate and muddy it down, giving us a nice worn, weathered base start for our skin. With all that said, we're now going to be tackling all of the browns and leathers and things like that. And because of some particular attributes that the Death Skulls like to do, we're actually not going to be painting things like the shirt in the primary blue colour. We're going to be just going for a bulk brown across the model. So let's grab a brown and get started on that. In order to paint all of the various brown elements, what we need to do is first grab a brown contrast and apply this across all of the clothing. This will give us a very nice dark brown base coat to work from. Once the contrast is dry, what we want to do is take some of the brown contrast and mix a small amount of a mid skin tone into it to give us a pinkish brown tone. This is slightly thinned because of the contrast anyway, but what we want to do is make sure it's thin enough so that we can use this to highlight the trousers. But rather than doing a normal layer or edge highlight, what we're going to do is apply many small dots or dashes across the areas of fabric. This will give us a slightly mottled texture look, perfect for worn out orc clothing. We do need to push it a little bit further after the first round of dotting or stippling by adding some more flesh to our mix, and then applying this in the same manner, but focusing more on the raised areas, similar to when we're doing a normal highlight. We can then finish off the stippling by taking the pure flesh tone that we used and applying this in a dotted stippling manner across the sharpest, most raised areas on the model. You will need to try and work on consistency when doing this technique, because we need to make sure it's the right consistency so that the dots stay formed and don't just randomly spread all across the model. But equally, we don't want it so dry that we're just smashing a dry tip into our model. This I generally find I achieve quite well by mixing our normal skin paint with a contrast. I find the contrast dilutes it quite well. It has the sort of retention properties I'm looking for, and it makes a nice liquid that we can just stipple across the various elements. And then we get that nice smooth transition in brightness from the brown contrast base up to the lightest mix. And we manage to get a nice amount of texture. But we do now need to kind of blend all of that in a little bit. And how we're going to do that is actually by making a mix of our base contrast that we use with just some contrast medium to make a thinner version, and we can use that on the areas we've just painted. This thinned contrast can then be slapped lightly all over the fabric areas, tying all of our stippling together while also adding a consistent overtone and a nice recessed shade. We want to make sure that we get a nice smooth coat of this without an excessive amount of pooling, so just mop up any areas that are a bit heavy. While this is drying, we can take the opportunity to tackle the blacks and the metals by putting down a coat of black contrast across all of the elements like the weapons, the pouches and the straps. We do need to let this element dry before we go around and do our next bit, which is going to be the blues across all of our Death Skulls. But before we do that, let's first talk about the Death Skulls and their love of the colour blue. Now, the Death Skulls as a clan for the Orks are probably, let's say, most known for their procurement skills. They're great at the looting and the plundering and the scavenging. They like to be relatively lucky and pick things up, and that is also why their main colour in the army is blue. Blue, similar to how red makes orcs go faster, it's a speedy colour. Blue is a lucky colour, and because the orcs want to be lucky in what they're scavenging, finding cool equipment, being able to hit their target, the Death Skulls cover themselves, their weapons and all sorts of things in blue paint or just blue things. So with that in mind, we're going to be tackling various blue elements on the model, including things like face paint. We will actually start off the painting of the blue elements by painting gloves before we move across to the face paint, as there are a couple of key differences in how we'll be doing it. For the gloves, as well as any other areas of leather or fabric that we want blue, we need to take a dark blue and apply a clean base coat across all of these fabric elements. This may take a couple of coats, but we want a nice, clean, full coverage base coat. And once that's dry, we can mix in a brighter, poppier blue to roughly a 50-50 mix and use this to highlight all of the edges and upward facing areas in a relatively broad manner, leaving the dark blue in all of the recesses. This means that we can then finish off the gloves and other elements with a highlight of our bright, pure blue, and this can be used to catch all of the sharpest folds, as well as the areas that would be hit by the most amount of light. So for example, on the gloves, that's going to be things like the knuckles, as well as the top upward facing areas. Now this brings us to face painting, which I mentioned earlier, and there's a kind of different technique that I'm using here. We are just still layering. We're going to be putting down a dark and then a lighter blue and then a lighter blue to replicate the light impacting an area that has been painted blue. However, what we also need to bear in mind is that to a degree, the orcs are probably not the most accurate with a paintbrush. In my mind, I imagine that what they're doing is grabbing a grot, sticking it in blue paint and wiping it across their face. But your interpretation of that might be slightly different. So with that in mind, I wanted to make sure that the skin was fully painted underneath, which is why we painted the majority of the skin first. But it also now means that we can layer the blue on top of the skin, leaving some of the greens in the recesses. So areas that either they might not be able to reach, so things like the back of the head. Also, areas that is likely to get worn away or rubbed off, so under the eyes or around the mouth, things like that. I can imagine that either the paint didn't get there, or it's rubbed off as they've been in battle, talking, fighting, whatever they want to do. Just tackle it however you feel is appropriate, but I went for this kind of scratchy, roughly applied method, but still keeping a straight half section down the center of the face. And that was started off just by a thin, careful line down the middle of the face. Bearing all of this in mind, let's start to apply our dark blue across the skin elements that we want to be covered in war paint. From here, we're going to be highlighting the blues using the same two color transitions as we did with the gloves. The first being a mix of our base coat and a bright blue, with the final edge highlight being made of just pure bright blue. But when we're highlighting these areas, we want to make sure that we're highlighting them similar to how we would have done the skin on the face. This is meant so that it's a layer of paint over the skin, and we're not just painting blue skin on the orc. With the face paint finished, we can look to highlight all of our black areas across the model, which will be remaining black as some of them have been painted black but will be metallic. We're going to be achieving this by taking our black, mixing in a small amount of flesh tone into it, which will give us a nice worn black grey leather look, and we can apply this across all of the black elements, highlighting as we go. The last few bits on this model is mainly the metallics, and we are going to be doing that with the same recipe as we did for the Evil Suns, so a dark silver and a bright silver, but the predominant difference here is how we're going to be applying it. And we're going to be essentially using overbrushing for both rounds, whereas for the Evil Suns we did an edge highlight after we did the initial overbrush. We're swapping that edge highlight out for the same colour, but with an overbrush application. What that will do is give us a nice worn, scratchy sort of edge highlight, which I think works really, really well for orcs that would go out and scavenge things quite often. Equally, if you happen to have an opponent that you play relatively often, you could in fact swap this out and paint certain elements with their colour scheme to kind of show your orcs trampling all over them, killing, looting, and then stealing certain elements and attaching it to their weaponry. But if you're kind of going for a generic army, you could just use, as we are here, just plain silvers and things like that. As we have already covered the overall technique for the metals, we're going to be jumping through this relatively quick. The first application is going to be our dark silver, and this will get overbrushed across all of the metal areas which have been base coated in black. We can then switch out this darker silver for a bright silver and use this in the same overbrushing manner, but do it in a more narrow area, targeting edges and things where there may be chips and damages. This just leaves us with smaller elements left, so things like teeth and claws, and similar to the last orc that we did, these can get a quick edge highlight of a bone after an initial base coat of a brown. Then let's finish off the entire model with a nice amount of red dotting for the eyes. And that gives us a finished Death Skull covered in his blue face paint and blue livery for his lucky looting journeys. That now gives us obviously 2 orcs painted in different styles. And I'm not going to sit here and compare them on every single next orc. That just seems to be a waste of your time. I will be doing a comparison at the end, so make sure to stick around for the comparison. But let me know if you at this point have a preference over the Evil Sun scheme or the Death Skull scheme. Put it down in the comments below. Let us know what's your favourite so far. And potentially while you're there, maybe even subscribe. But with that said, what we now need to do is move across to our 3rd Ork clan. And this one is going to be one of the more brutal clans, the Snakebites. Kicking off these boys, perfect for beast snaggers, what we're going to do is tackle this skin. And for this scheme, we're going to start off with a darkish black cyan colour. This gives us a really rich, dark, cool tone to build up upon later. Once the skin is dry, we can go around and block out all of the other areas, which, to help show the wild nature of these orcs, we can base coat near enough all of the other elements in a dark brown. We want to catch anything like fabrics, leather straps, but we can also use this base coat to cover any areas that are going to be metal, similar to how we use the black contrast in other schemes. Blocking out all of the brown elements has a couple of advantages. First off, we get the advantage that all of our elements that we've base coated in brown are now going to look fairly cohesive. And that's because we can now change the highlight colors we're mixing in and do them in different highlights, but the actual core shadow color is all going to be the same, meaning that it will look quite cohesive because that color's present in all of the mixes we'll be doing. The other benefit is now we've got that dark shadow color, we can use it as a point of comparison to how bright we should start pushing our skin to start off with. And then obviously once we've done the rest of it, we can adjust it a little bit more if we need to. And to do the skin, what we're going to need is our initial base coat color, as well as a sort of yellowish, greenish, dirty green tone as our highlight color. We want to take our base coat color and our new highlight color and then mix these together into roughly a 75% mix of dark and then roughly 25% being our highlight tone. This mix can then be used as a very broad highlight. Essentially, we're using it to cover all elements of the skin, leaving the base coat in only the deepest of recesses. From here, we can add some more of our highlight color to the mix, coming to roughly a 50-50 ratio, and then use this to reinforce all of those last rounded highlights. We want to be hitting, as before, both the upward and downward facing areas of skin, and on this pass it will give it a nice overall green skin tone. Mixing in more of our highlight color, we get to around 75% of our mix being our dirty yellow green, and this gives us a nice pale green highlight, which can be used to pick out the highest areas on all of the upward facing areas or any sharper areas on things like the knuckles. We will then look to finish off the skin with a final highlight of the pure yellow green. This will hit the most raised areas such as the topward facing areas of muscles, facial features, hands, knuckles, and things like that. With the last round of highlights being done, the skin is pretty much good. We may want to just brighten it up a little bit depending on how bright we push the various leathers, which I said we're going to be starting from the brown that we've already applied. And this brown is really good for neutral tones, but if I was painting an army of these, I might consider swapping this out for whatever color I'm painting the squigs. Because in my mind, the orcs generally get their clothing and farming and things like that from the squigs that they grow. So therefore, if you're using purple or red or green squigs, you could use purple, red or green fabrics, leathers and trousers, which will give you that nice feel of the Snakebites who live that more barbarian and rural existence, so they're more likely to be using those sorts of elements. However, here we are, as I said, going for a kind of neutral tone, which is just brown as our base coat and various different shades of brown as our highlight for different areas. For all of these areas, we are going to want to do a relatively muddy wet blend, and this is where we can utilize a small amount of paint retarder, which will keep the paints wetter for longer as we apply this technique. We are going to want to mix that into the base coat for our browns, and then apply essentially another base coat layer across our chosen areas. Then we can come back in with our highlight color and use this to mix brighter patches on the various elements. So for things like the shirt, we opted for a pale blue, shifting the overall colour into a desaturated pale purple skin tone once we mixed it on the model. For the trousers, we used a medium brown as our lighter colour, and the wet blend across this section of the trousers on all of the raised areas gives us a darker, more neutral brown tone. Then we have elements like the straps, the belts and pouches. These elements didn't get necessarily any wet blending, they just got a quick edge highlight with a mid-tone brown mixed with our base coat. And this is because those locations were, to be honest, too small to worry about wet blending. We did, however, wet blend the tabard on the crotch, and we wet blended this using the same colours as the straps, and that's because this is a slightly larger area, and by using the brighter brown it separates it from the rest of the trousers, which we painted darker. There are a couple different ways of doing this wet blending. I call this one that I'm doing dirty wet blending or muddy wet blending, and the reason for that is because where we're doing a full layer of our base coat darker colour and then applying the lighter colour on top of that and mixing on the model, naturally we're not going to ever get our full brightness from our highlight colour because the main area has been mixed. So we get that muddier mixed tone. But because we've applied the base coat area over the whole thing, we've got that nice option to blend it all together and get some nice smooth transitions. The other option that you will mainly see if you wanted to get some brighter, more poppier colours is essentially to do the inverse, which is where you would paint the lighter colour down on sections that you want brightest first, then apply the darker colours around it and blend in the transition in the middle. This gives you the advantage of having that brighter pure colour at your brightest point and then it blending into your darker brown, but you've potentially got a smaller transition point to try and blend between. So it's kind of worth experimenting, seeing what you find best. The way that we're doing it here I quite like. I find it efficient and easy to do, but it does mean that we may need to come in with some glazing just to brighten up the wet blended areas. Anyway, back to the model. What we want to do is take our highlight colours from the various wet blends that we've done and then use these to reinforce the brighter sections of the wet blend. This will take the form of thin layers of glaze on the brightest, flattest surfaces, along with some line edge highlights across certain various elements. Once we have gone across and highlighted all of these areas, we can give all of them a wash to tie them back together. Here we've opted to use a flesh tone. This will add a little bit of warmth from the red within the wash itself, but this could easily be swapped out for an earth tone or simply another brown muddy wash. Jumping quickly across to the boots, these were treated in a much more simple way. First they got the same brown base coat as all of the other elements, but the boots did not get any highlighting. They simply got a black wash, which will help to show any of the recesses. Wait, hang on, we've got nearly all the way through this scheme and we haven't yet touched on the small amount of lore for the Snakebites, just that little bit of flavour for you. And essentially, the Snakebites don't have a colour similar to the Evil Sons or the Death Skulls. These are more of the old school boys. These are the rugged, traditional style of orcs. Generally, these are the ones that I would imagine and you would see as your beast snagger boys, the ones riding around on giant beasts and animals, as opposed to going in with giant mechs and technology. Because of that, I equally think that they probably don't have the teeth to spend on good grots with intelligence to repair things, and they don't care massively about the small effects that wear and tear could have on your weapon. As long as it's still good enough to carve through a squig, it's probably good enough. So with that in mind, what we're going to be doing is doing the weapons slightly different to how we've done all of the others so far, and starting off with the bronze. We want to use this bronze to base coat all of the areas of metal. This can be done in a partially patchy manner if we want to, and that's because we've used a matte brown base coat for all of the areas that we're painting. But we do want the majority of the area to have this nice metallic brown base coat. Once this is down, what we then want to do is apply some simple silver. This will be a relatively dark silver, but what we want to do is apply it via stippling. What we're going to do is use a small semi-ruined brush and then lightly smash the tip into the areas that we want the paint applied. This will give us a worn, patchy look to the metals. If we focus more of the silver application where we would expect there to be impact and damage, This will help reflect the impression of chipping or removing tarnish from multiple impacts. We can then finish it off by giving the teeth, nails and everything like that a quick bone highlight, and the model is good to go. This brings us to the end of our third clan. The Snakebites are done. And as you can see, we've used yet again more techniques and a different style for this boy compared to the other ones that we've done so far. So let me know, what's your favourite so far? But if you wanted an orc that potentially isn't as bright, isn't as punchy, or is a little bit smarter than your average Snakebite, maybe you even want an army that you can't see, well then what you want to do is make sure that you stick around as we tackle the Blood Axes as our next clan. Believe it or not, we are going to be starting off with the skin, but this time we are going to use some wet blending for the skin. We want two tones, the first being a dark black green, and then the second one being a brighter tone of jade. These can then be wet blended like our leathers on the other models. Once we've applied a base coat of our black green mixed with a small amount of retarder, we can then come back in with a fresh application of our brighter jade and then apply this to all of the areas where light would impact the model the most. So things like bulging areas of muscle and head areas, hands, and anything that we want those brighter attention drawing details. This mixing will give us a slightly turquoise looking skin tone. Because of the retarder, we will need to wait for this to dry fully and it will take longer than normal. So while it does, let's jump across to the leathers. Starting with the trousers, we are going to wet blend these as well. We're going to be wet blending up from a dark umber to a more yellowish ochre tone. Like the rest of the wet blending, this gives us a smooth, quick transition from the dark areas to our brighter areas. In order to align these straps to the rest of the model, we can also give these areas a nice clean coat of our ochre highlight colour that we used on the trousers. We will then come back to this later on to finish these areas off. There are going to be a couple of areas on here that we want to pick out separately so that they don't blend in with the overall elements, and that mainly on this model is going to be his crotch blanket. And we don't want to paint this the same as the trousers because it will just blend in entirely. So instead what we did is use the same base coat, brown umber and wet blending, but we swapped out the highlight colour for a bone tone, which gives us a nice sort of pale skin-like looking effect. And we just whipped that up the same as we did with all of the other elements. So for the tabard, to show you what I mean, what we're going to do is utilize wet blending, starting from a base layer of brown, and then coming in with our lighter bone to highlight and mix this on the model, which will give us a nice skin-like tone. But we will also need to come in and then block out a few other elements, but this time using black. This will be great for any of the smaller elements we don't want to attract attention to. Things like the boots will get a base coat of black, but we can also use this black to base coat anything like armor and weapons. By the time that we have done all of this, we should be good to come back to the skin. First, we're going to want to mix up a mid-tone of our two skin colors, similar to the current brightest mix on our model. We will then glaze this over the brightest sections to help reinforce and build up the highlights made through the wet blend. Then once this has dried, we can clean it up a little bit further by mixing more of our bright jade into the skin mix, giving us a bright bluish green skin tone, which can then be used as a final highlight across all of the elements of skin, giving us a really nice, almost moonlit skin tone. With the skin done, we now have the option to choose what we want to tackle next. And what I'm thinking we should do is tackle all of the metals. Because of a particular want and style of the Blood Axes, we're going to need the metals painted for some future steps. And while we're on the subject, let's talk a little bit about the Blood Axes. Now, the Blood Axes are not your typical orc as viewed by other orcs. These orcs are, well, some would say slightly more intelligent than the rest of the orcs, but they have the ability to learn, they emulate, they are the sneaky boys. They are the ones that like to actually use tactics, they utilize camouflage. They've even been known to use strategic retreating in certain cases, which is generally un-orky. These are also the orcs that have been known to ally with the Imperium for overall strategic planning, because it actually helps them in the long run to have a battle where the Imperium are helping them. Things like that that normally orcs wouldn't do because orcs just want to fight. These guys have a little bit more thought and cunning behind them. And that makes them not particularly trusted by other orcs, which I think is quite a fun thing. So with that said, let's jump back to the actual painting, because we're going to look at painting the metals so that we can then look at painting some camouflage. We are going to need to apply this base coat so that it covers all of the elements across the weapons and gives a nice, clean, shiny coat. This will give us a brilliant platform to work from. While it dries, we might as well paint elements like the teeth. Like all of the other orcs that we've painted so far, this is a simple edge highlight of bone over a brown base coat. By the time we finish all of those various smaller elements, we should have some dry metal equipment, and this means we can start to apply the camouflage. There are so many different camo patterns available out there, and most of them, to be honest, are kind of trademarked by militaries and countries and things like that, but that doesn't particularly matter for this. What we want to do is just use them as a reference and see which patterns and colors we like, because the techniques we're going to be using here are pretty much universal and we can use to replicate a lot of different camo patterns. And the main difference is just the colors that we're looking at doing. So whether that's whites, grays and blacks for snow camo, or whether it's browns, greens and browns for woodland camo, you can just recreate it however you want. That's also why you may have noticed that some of our elements on this particular boy is brighter, so the trousers are a brighter brown than all of the others we've done. And that is just to help us apply this camo and have it stand out, because the brighter the base coat, the more the pattern that we apply on top of it will show up. So it's just worth bearing that in mind when you're painting your previous steps. But with that said, let's grab our favorite colors and get to camo painting. Let's start off by painting some blue camo. For this, we want a dark blue, a light blue, a black and a white. Kicking it off, we want to apply a coat of our dark blue across the area where we want to apply the camo. Then, while this is wet, we can come in and add stripes of the light blue. This, because both elements are wet, will bleed nicely across into the dark blue, giving us a base of our pattern. Then we can take our blacks and our whites and recreate little dashes and dots across the area. Using the white first means that we have less struggle trying to go over the blacks to get a clean color. Essentially what we're doing here is making a combination of lines and apostrophe shapes, essentially a splodge with a line coming out of it. And then with the blacks, we're just applying simple thin lines across all of the areas. We may need to do a little bit of back and forth to get a nice pattern to emerge, but overall, that's how we are painting this blue camo. Similar to when we painted the death skulls earlier, we need to remember that what we're doing here is applying paint on top of a painted surface. And yes, that's what we're doing all the time. I mean, in lore and in world, this is a gun or a grenade that they've got that was silver and they've then painted blue with camo. So bearing that in mind, it means that we can do things like not take the blue to the entirety of the edge so that it looks like bits have been missed, the brush didn't go the whole way. And we need to do this so that it looks kind of careless, but equally be aware that we're being careless and not just be careless when we're doing this. So it's a bit of an art to a degree. And it's a fun little practice. It's just things like missing out little bits of metal around rivets where genuinely you would look at an orc and not expect them to be the most upright and caring of painters. So with all that said, let's jump into our other camo patterns. Next, we're going to be doing a red camo, and this is going to be applied in the same way as our blue camo, but naturally using red tones. Laying down a dark red base coat before adding in the lines of our lighter red while it's wet. This gives us the same base coat that we can then follow on top of with a combination of blacks and whites. This time, however, rather than doing the splodge apostrophe type shapes, we went for a combination of thick white lines and thin black lines in various different orientations. Then it's time to tackle the trousers, and here we only need a black, a green and a dark brown, as the light brown of our trousers will take the place of the base coat colour such as the dark red in our reds. We chose a set of shapes for each colour and then applied them in varying layers and positions. For the dark brown, we went for a small block shape, similar to the shape of a paisley. Then for the blacks, we used a selection of semi-thick lines in various different directions. And finally, the greens were applied in a teardrop or leaf shape, giving us a nice desert jungle style camo. Once we've got all of these camo patterns down, we essentially then need to go in and tie and shade all of the metals. And anything that we've done that is metal, either whether it's got a camo pattern or is still just plain metal, we want to give that a coat of a dark shaded green. Conveniently, we've got a camo shade color here that we're going to be using. And what this will do is add a nice little bit of patina, aging and recess shading to all of those metal areas, while also slightly discoloring the blue and the red camo pattern that we've done, making it look older and slightly more worn. Rather than leaving it here, we're going to do another form of camo, and this is the good old-fashioned Rambo face stripes, and for this we need the same colours as we used for the trousers. These browns and blacks are simply going to be applied across the skin of the orc's face in simple, careful lines. This is one of the reasons why we wanted a slightly brighter or tinted skin tone for these boys, as a dark green skin will not show up the camo pattern of the greens and the blacks as well, while this brighter, more bluish skin that we've gone for shows up these camo patterns slightly more. So we just need to slowly apply lines in varying directions across the face, giving us a completed blood axe boy. I do just need to point out that I forgot one element in the painting, and that is the straps. These essentially just got the same wash as the rest of the metals, so we got a camo shade wash. Whereas naturally you could also swap this out for a brown or a black wash if that more meets your aesthetic. With that done though, I guess it's now time for me to interrupt myself and essentially just point out that if you made it this far and you liked the video, one, I hope you've liked the video, but more so, we try to make content like this on a regular basis, at least once a week. So if you're liking this video and the sort of content and the style that we've got going here, why not subscribe? Because we'll try and keep these sorts of things going on into the future, and I appreciate the time if you do subscribe. With that all said, we do still have one Ork clan left, and that is the shiniest, the richest of the boys, the Bad Moons. For this scheme, the main colour besides the skin is going to be a yellow. So we can opt to paint the skin in a more neutral green tone. And we're going to be doing this once again by wet blending. We can start off with a base coat of a slightly desaturated dark green mixed with a small amount of paint retarder. Then applying this across all of the skin before we come in using a fairly bright lime green, and then highlighting the area in the wet blend with this colour. This will give us that nice quick transition that we get from wet blending, and we can come back later on once the paint has dried to push up the brightness. So let's tackle the trousers, straps and boots. Here, because the yellow is likely to be quite bright, we are going to be painting these areas in a dark, almost black grey, which will add more separation than if we went for browns in these areas, which are kind of in the same hue as the yellows. Now for this model, we've essentially done a zenithal, which is from a red base coat to a white highlight, and that is perfectly fine, but we do need to tint the whites slightly. What we need to do for how we're going to be doing the yellows is actually moving them from white to more of a pinkish, slightly skin tone hue. And the easiest way to do that is to grab a pinkish skin type hue and start glazing that over the main white elements from our prime, which will guide the elements of highlight later on. This should be a nice and simple process that just requires us to take our chosen colour, dilute it slightly with a little bit of water, and then trace over the white elements from our zenithal prime, slowly changing these raised areas from white to a off pink flesh tone. This also means that we can pick out any of the creases or raised areas in the lower sections that the white spray may have missed and are still predominantly red. We are then going to be finishing off the highlights by taking a bright light flesh tone and doing some edge highlights. This will allow us to have a nice bright spot across those areas that is not pure white. Then we can take a yellow contrast or make up a yellow contrast and use this to tint all of those areas, giving us a nice yellow. On this model, we actually needed 2 coats of the contrast, and that's because we chose to do something that in hindsight I probably shouldn't have bothered doing, which was to try and take one of my Vallejo yellows, one of the really bright ones, and then diluting it with some contrast medium to get a contrast effect on the paint. It's worked before with certain different colours, but yellow is obviously quite a tricky one, and I probably should have just used the yellow contrast that's on the shelf behind me. But you live and you learn, so I needed to do a couple of coats of that yellow. But if you want to see a different way of painting yellow, because there are lots of different ways, we have actually got a video where we painted up an Eldar combat patrol in predominantly yellow as the colour. So if you want to see how we did that after this video, why not check it out? But for this, just to let you know, I probably should have done that. We had to do 2 coats of our yellow mix. And because of that, we're also going to have to come in and do some edge highlighting later on. These edge highlights need to be carefully applied across any of the raised elements on the yellow areas, as well as any areas that retain a little bit too much of the original colour, thanks to our poor man's contrast mix. This will give us a final bright fabric and bright yellow, and then we can move across to the weapons, which are going to be treated a little bit different from all of our other orcs, by giving the metals a couple of coats of a metallic bronze. This will need a couple of coats in order to get good coverage, as we're going to be going over the prime and not a darker base coat. While the areas we did not hit with bronze, we'll be getting a dark silver, so all of our metallics are either in a complete coat of a dark silver, or a complete coat of a bronze. We're painting the metals in this way because out of all of the clans that we've done today, the Bad Moons are the, let's say, richest clans. They are the ones that care most about the money, the materials, the teeth that they use to buy things. And they often go around with flamboyant, overly excessive elements. So you've got gold weaponry, gold plated, and that's because they've got the teeth to buy the better weaponry, the higher tech stuff, as well as the grots that know how to actually clean things. So that is kind of the lore aspect, the brief look at the Bad Moons. Essentially, they like to wear yellow and they like to be rich and wealthy. It's kind of known that some other orc war bosses have occasionally kept Bad Moons around just for the fact that they've got a lot of teeth, and if they need to buy something, they can smash the teeth out of the Bad Moons and then just go and buy the grots they want to eat. But with that all said, that's the background on the Bad Moon, so let's finish off the weapons. Finishing off the metals, all we want to do is brighten up our past work on all of the metal areas. So for the bronze areas, we're going to be going at it with a bright gold, and for the darker silver areas, we naturally want a brighter silver. Taking these colours, we can work around the model, panel and edge highlighting all of the metal areas with the appropriate highlight colour. This gives us that really nice shine on all of the edges and makes our metals look brighter and more show off because of the clean painting style that we've done on these ones, as opposed to the stippling and overbrushing highlight methods that we did before. Then we can do some touch-ups on the skin. Here what we're going to do is glaze our bright green from our mix across all of the highlighted areas, bringing up the brightness across the skin until we are happy with the balance between the skin itself and the yellow clothing. This wraps up our 5 schemes for this video, and there is a little tidbit that I just want to go over, a sort of secret that I want to mention in a minute. But before we get to that, let's look at how all the boys came out. I overall quite like what we did here. We deliberately painted multiple elements in different ways. We painted the skin different from boy to boy, and most of the things like leathers were painted in different recipes and techniques. And I really enjoyed what we did. Jumping back to me quickly, there is a little bit here that is about that secret I mentioned, and what I want to highlight is that naturally we can mix and match these elements. That's the secret and the joy of the hobby. I don't want you just to watch this video and go, that's how to paint Evil Sons. For example, if you like the overall way we've done Evil Sons, but you prefer the skin of the Death Skulls, there's no reason why you can't mix and match those up, whether it's for the entire army or you're mixing it up just for individual models throughout units. It's a wide fantasy 40k world out there, and you can justify whatever you really want to do. With that said, we haven't used decals on these, and there are certain decals that you can add to reinforce the clan nature, whether that be checkerboards, fire flames, or just the clan emblems. So we could go over and do that as well, just to push the models a little bit further. But that's going to be for another video. Now, if you're sat there as an Ork fan going, hang on a second, there's something that's clearly missing from this video, you're right, we didn't paint the biggest and the baddest clan, the Ork Goths. But that's because we've got a video here, which if you check that out, should have you covered. It's a suitable goth scheme, and potentially with just the application of some checkerboards, you're ready to go. So check that out. Otherwise, do remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.